Good afternoon. I'm Amy Willis with Econlib, and I am delighted to have with me today my fellow Econlib contributor, Alberto Mingardi, joining us from Milan. Alberto, would you like to say hello?
Hello, Amy. Very nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. For Econlog readers in particular, they know that you have been on the front lines of the coronavirus crisis, living in Lombardy as you do, and you've had a great deal of experience and a great deal to say about it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what it's been like to live in arguably the worst spot in the world for the pandemic?
Yes, I think the outbreak in Lombardy has been terrible. The region has been severely hit. This represents a very big trouble for Italy at large, economically speaking, because Lombardy and Veneto, the neighboring region, the region of Venice, are really the economic heart of the country. So between Lombardy and Veneto, we are producing something like 1/3 of Italy's GDP. And the part of Lombardy that have been more severely hit are small towns, interestingly, near Milan and Lodi, so south of Milan, and near Bergamo, which is a bit east of Milan. And there, particularly near Bergamo, the death toll has been very high. Happily, I am not in the front line in the sense that I didn't have personally the experience of meeting the virus, and I'm very glad I didn't have it. I knew of people, of friends who had the coronavirus, as many of us do nowadays in the world. It is actually interesting and frightening how different were the symptoms. I mean, some people had the coronavirus in a very, very light way. I mean, for them, it was really comparable with the flu, but for others, it was a very serious, very problematic disease. Milan is locked down. We have been effectively, home arrested for the last 40 days. We cannot get out of our flats. We need to stay within 200 meters from our flats and houses if we want to exercise. If you get out, you need to be going to the grocery, or you need to have a printed form with a whole bunch of expressions of bureaucratic jargon with which you basically justify the fact that you need to take advantage of your freedom to move for some very special reason, like you're going to your office, which, by the way, I did today because I just wanted to check if there was anything in the mail, if there was any bill to pay and stuff like that. So indeed, what Italians have been experiencing is, I think, the sharpest reduction in their daily liberty in democratic republican time. I think was no other instance, no other moment in the history of our country. I mean, including during fascism, in which personal liberty was so severely limited. By which I don't mean that the Italian government is authoritarian. I don't think the people in government now have some particular project for turning Italy into a dictatorship, but it's sort of an unintended authoritarianism. So the way in which they respond to the emergency is by restraining people's freedom, also because, quite frankly, we do still need to discover more things about the virus and how to fight it.
That's a strong and frankly scary statement, but I have a couple of questions. The first one, just sort of for point of reference for listeners. You mentioned that Lombardy and Veneto account for about 1/3 of Italian GDP. Can you give us just an idea of what size of, like, how much of the population of Italy does that represent? So it's 1/3 of GDP, but it's not 1/3 of the country, correct?
No, it's not 1/3 of the country. So Lombardy is 9 million people. Veneto actually need to check. So you
That's
need
okay.
to give me a second because I don't know how many people live in Veneto. I suppose around 4 million, but that's my guess. Yes, it's a bit less than 5 million. So altogether, Lombardy and Veneto can be considered like 14 million people. Italy is 60 million.
Wow. That's quite a comparison. Are you aware of any what you would consider accurate predictions about what will be the fate of GDP over the next year for Italy? How much of a
Well, there are a
reduction is expected?
bunch of predictions, and forecasts have gone worse,
Mm,
predictably, in this
mm,
sense, uh, um, uh, since the outbreak. So, right from the beginning, 2020 was not to be the year of the great Italian recovery. That's for sure. So, growth was around zero point 0.1. The estimate was that in January before the outbreak. Now, right at the beginning, people thought, it's going to be minus 2%, minus 3%. Now the IMF says minus 9%. Uh, but we really need to wait and see because uh, clearly it's quite difficult to understand how much of Italian economic activity is gone and how much of it is gone forever.
mm,
There is actually one good element in this situation is that some newspapers have been speculating that actually there is a higher number of firms and companies that are still active in spite of the lockdown. So the way in which it works has been quite bizarre. So the government wanted to basically shut businesses down for a while in order to reduce movement, and by reducing movement, reducing contagion. But of course, you need people not to die by starvation in the meanwhile. So they decided they wanted to find some essential supply chains that could stay open in the process. Then, to identify these essential supply chains, they try to use a system of classifying economic activity, which was really a bureaucratic one. So it happens that you establish your own firm, and the firm is new, and you say, "Yeah, what do you do? I do these." But then, of course, time passes, and you may change what you do and evolve your business and that sort of stuff. So they realize that actually, the world is not really divided into these perfectly neat supply chain that never cross one each other. So they move from that system into an Italian solution, which is called autocertificazione, self-certification. So you basically need to declare that you need to stay open because you're part of this essential supply chain, and you do that to the prefect, which is basically really so to say, the local sentinel of the central government. Um, Clearly, this is not a perfect system. It is creating loopholes and problems, and very often some people are voicing concern. And you, quite frankly, for once, you clearly understand trade unions, because trade unions are supposed to be representing the interest of their members, and the media are so full of reports and news about the coronavirus. Nobody is speaking about anything else in this moment. Clearly, workers are concerned, particularly workers that do not have the luxury of doing what we're doing now, which is giving lectures or recording them, doing this kind of stuff. So it's not a perfect system. Still, it allowed a bunch of companies to stay open. And as said, many newspapers are rumoring that more people are working than they should, which could be good for the economy at the end. At the very same time, there are entire businesses, entire industries that are completely, lost. I mean, and I don't think anybody has a clear picture of what hotels are going to be doing in a month from now, or restaurants. I mean, um, of course, I mean, restaurants are not the backbone of the Italian GDP, still are quite important when it comes to people's lifestyle.
Yes.
And so the Italian restaurant, historically speaking, with the exception of big cities and fancy places, but traditionally the Italian restaurant is a trattoria. I mean, trattoria is some sort of the Italian equivalent of a diner. And the Italian trattoria is typically small, is typically run by a family, so you're never really sure, how many salaries are there. I mean, it's one or it's three, it's the father, the mother, the son, whatever. But also, trattorias are very often very small spaces, and one cannot but wonder, how many people they'll be able to fit in with this new necessity to stay distant one from the other. Also, Italy is basically made of a tremendous number of small and medium-sized businesses, and really the bulk of them are, in terms of number of businesses, of course, not of people providing employment, but the bulk of them are very small businesses. In a sense, this could be good because these are entrepreneurs that are very used to adapt to sometimes highly difficult circumstances and to the Italian bureaucracy, which is, an achievement by itself. But on the other hand, I really think that lots of them will just ponder: shall we open again or not? They may be businessmen, small entrepreneurs who had two, three crises, perhaps more in their lifetime. And each time they found the courage, because it's something which is in the entrepreneurial gene, to start anew, but they may not want to do so this time. So I think we will figure it out when we open. And as it was pointed out by many American commentators, I think it is also important to consider the fact that at the end, it will be the people who will decide how much of the economy is open again. Because clearly, the coronavirus is making a very strong impression on the popular mind. So it may change our behavior, if not forever, for a certain amount of time, sufficient to be somehow deciding of the future of entire businesses. Sorry.
Quite all right. So, with regard to this issue of supply chains, as I've talked to a lot of our friends throughout, we've noted several businesses sort of shifting their productive activities into other areas. Do you find, so this is sort of a dual question, the notion of this sort of self-declaration, sorry, I can't say the Italian word, of businesses, that I declare I am an essential industry. Do you find that businesses are declaring something other than what their original intention was? And then, especially as you just mentioned, Italy is so heavily populated by small businesses. How do you think that's going to change? I mean, do you think that you will no longer have as many small to mid-sized firms, or do you think that you will maintain the same number, but they will be different firms, or will they be firms that have adapted somehow their productive activity to meet a different sort of demand post-pandemic?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I wish I could answer. My guess is that really the political response will change everything. So in this moment, the government is basically helping companies, is helping businesses in getting credit. There are government guarantees for loans to businesses. But at the very same time, in Italy and in Spain, companies are prohibited from firing people.
Yeah.
So you cannot fire anybody. clearly this sounds very nice, but the other side of the coin is that this is making very difficult at any moment in the future to hire new people. Um, I think in not now necessarily, but 1 month, 2 months from now, we will need a massive reallocation of resources in the economy from businesses that could not work under this condition in this a new environment, which is not going to be forever, but it's going to lasting for a few months, perhaps for a couple of years. Uh, to businesses that actually could thrive in this environment. Um, you know, grocery delivery, for example.
Mm.
Now, I go to the grocery myself because I want to get out and enjoy a little walk. And, my mother was telling me the other day that's the first time in your life that you spend 40 days in the same city without traveling anywhere. And that could be true, actually.
Yeah.
Um, so I enjoy nowadays going to my local supermarket as going to New York. It's my daily joy, and I suppose lots of people I tend to buy too many apples and strawberries these days. But still, but I wanted to see, how was this experience of getting your stuff delivered to your flat. So I think I ordered some items, ham, apples, and yogurt, that sort of stuff, on March, I think was 10, 12, something like that. And I got it on March 31st. I mean, clearly the
Wow.
service is there, and these supermarkets want to do it, but they don't have quite as many people as they need to deliver stuff to their potential customers. Well, I suppose they would be happy to hire people, uh, but of course, it's a very uncertain environment. I mean, so far, production has been quite smooth. So this reasoning by supply chain did not disrupt too many of them. So you got stuff arriving to your supermarket and your supermarket selling it, but you're not really sure that's going to be going on for 1 or 2 months. And clearly, in a very trade unionized country like this, the labor market is quite inflexible, so you don't necessarily want to hire people today. So I think the problem of the country is that we will need uh, some more flexibility if we want companies to survive and to adapt even more than they did. For sure, many Italian manufacturing companies have adapted in the last month. It's quite amazing just reading the paper and seeing the amount of entrepreneurial creativity, of course, mostly for doing rather simple items. I mean, face masks are not
Mhm.
rocket science, and Italy is the second manufacturing country in Europe after Germany, so people should be able to do that. And of course, Italy is famous for fashion, and there's a number of companies that were making T-shirts and similar stuff before, and now they're making face masks. Um, but also more complicated stuff. Automobile companies are trying to produce ventilators in Italy. Ferrari is doing lots of items useful for fighting coronavirus. So in that sense, we're witnessing something similar to what you witness in the US. When it comes to the future, I think that in some sense, um, my gut feeling is that lots of these companies will just close forever, uh, particularly in areas like uh, tourism and service. You know, for lots of people, you are a dentist of a certain age, and you spent in the last month and perhaps an extra month in which you're not working at all. So you want to go on. or you want just to retire if you can. That's clearly a possibility. Um, but besides this, I mean, I think in particularly in the food business, when it comes to hotel and transportation, there may be lots of changes. Public transportation is going to be the biggest challenge, I think, for governments in terms of rethinking it. When it comes to the number of businesses per se, I really don't know, because my other gut feeling is that it's going to be a terrible labor market, the one in which young Italian of age 25, 26, 27 are going to be entering. So what they do, the best and brightest of them typically used to migrate. So Italy was exporting, roughly speaking, 100,000 young good minds every year. Migration is going to be a bit more difficult in the next few years. So I think it will. I hope, and I think it will still be possible if you have somebody who has a job ready for you with your name on, so to say. But generally speaking, moving and trying to find a job in another jurisdiction is going to be more difficult than it was. I suppose that for some of these young people, self-employment or trying to develop your own startup may be a solution. And this is why I think the government first priority should be getting rid of red tape in order to make this possible.
Sounds like a ham and apple delivery service is a good idea right now.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, yes. I have to say, home delivery is working quite well in Milan for restaurants.
Yeah.
So we do have all of these companies with riders. It's interesting because a few months ago, they were a big problem in the eye of the government
The
because,
restaurants?
of course, the Deliveroo and these home delivery services, because of course they employ riders, and it's a very particular kind of job. So you decide when you want to switch on, you decide when you want to switch off. It is actually extremely good for migrants because you need a bike, you need your smartphone, you don't even need to speak the language because the app is doing everything for you. So I think it was very good for this sort of people. But it was perceived very badly because, of course, it was difficult to fit into, kind of contracts that are already regulated and properly trade unionized, as somebody would say. But nowadays, these people are very important, and I think I suppose that attempts to increase regulation on them would be very unpopular, and I hope there may be some attempt to deregulate them so that they can develop also in other parts of the country. Because you have them in Milan, you have them in Turin, but certainly if you want the restaurant business to survive, you need them also in smaller towns.
Yeah. Well, this is a good segue to a question you've started to answer at the very least. You mentioned that you think a massive reallocation of resources is coming our way, with which I don't disagree. It sounds like, initially I was going to ask whether you thought that reallocation would be more painful or more painless. It sounds like you think it might be somewhat painful, but one of the things, at least to me, that I don't think there's been enough talk of is the differences in the experience both now under lockdown and in this future potential reallocation between members of different social classes, income levels, and so on and so forth. Do you think, are there particular groups that you fear are going to be have a harder time than others when we finally are released?
Well, I'm not. Well, I used to say that most of discussion about inequalities was propaganda. Let's put it this way. But I think now we do see a burgeoning problem. Clearly, there are kinds of work and there are categories of workers who are not suffering this very much. I mean, Italy has quite a few public employees, and clearly public employees are shielded from some of these problems. I think that for lawyers, what is happening now is basically teaching them that they don't need offices in very expensive buildings in the center of Milan. But when it comes to their work, they can go on. It is actually quite surprising, but also very good news, the fact that Italian academia, which is not famous for being flexible and agile, has actually reacted tremendously well to this situation. So all of us moved into Zooming or Microsoft Teams and that sort of way of delivering lectures. Some of us record lectures as podcasts. I think students were very happy at the beginning of this because it was exciting, it was new, and now they're really missing hanging out with each other in the university cafeteria more than anything else. But I think Italian teachers did very well. Still, you do have families, and this is important not so much for university students, but for younger kids. You do have families that have one single PC in their flat, and some people do not have a laptop or a PC in their flat. It is interesting, I've been told by people in the business that, the cheapest laptop have basically gone away because everybody who could and needed it bought a 3,000 euros laptop for the reason that it needed to allow their kids to attend lectures. So that's a very big potential source of inequality. Also, quite frankly, there are some sectors in the economy that could be less safe than others for a variety of reasons. I mean, protecting yourself from anything requires a learning process. So you need to educate workers. They need to be willing to endure a whole bunch of procedures. One thing I suppose all of us need to be willing to do is enduring lots of more queuing, whatever we're going to be doing in the next few months and years. And also, I think there is a clear perception by some workers that it's unfair that others can stay home and keep getting their salary and be protected, whereas they need to go and be exposed to a higher degree of risk. I'm not a fan of trade unions, generally speaking. But I think that in these circumstances, trade unions have a very important role to play. The government is playing with, national plans about what sort of factories and businesses ought to be opening first. I think a better way will be decentralizing the decision, because even within the boundaries of the same industry, and perhaps even within the boundaries of the same company, factory A is different than factory B, because it uses newer machineries, because it does things one way or another, because it's bigger, because it's smaller. And I think this is something which is much better left to local negotiation between trade unions and business owners. It's not going to be perfect, but for once, the interest of these players are aligned. Clearly, entrepreneurs want to open to do their job, but also I think that the trade unions realize that if they don't open, there may be no longer workers to enroll in as their members. So, I think that one of the big trouble we do have is that the government, but this is really a disease of the public, of public opinion, even more than of the government. The government would like to have a blueprint for everybody, a
Sure.
plan. And public opinion would like to have that too, because even now different regions have slightly different norms, and people have troubles in understanding why. They have problems in understanding why, why I can do that if I live in Padua, but I cannot do that if I live in Milan.
Hmm.
So everybody wants a one size fits all approach, but this is exactly the kind of circumstance in which a one size fits all approach is going to be terrible. So I think if decentralization is better than centralization, and perhaps decentralization to the level of a single factory, using the fact that trade unions, like them or not, have relevant knowledge. So and clearly they care about workers' well-being, which is very important, very important too. Uh, the the public health situation in different regions of Italy is hugely different. And clearly, if you are Sardinia or Sicily, so if you're an island, you have a totally different situation than
Yeah.
Lombardy or Tuscany these days. Um, I think reopening the economy should be a process differentiated on a variety of levels, beginning with geography, clearly, because that's a factor. But I think that ultimately the better solution would be really decentralizing the decision-making process. But of course, this is not a very popular view in Italy at this time.
I can imagine. Well, I have just one last quick question for you, because you just spoke about how you think things ought to go as we try to emerge from the pandemic situation. What's your best guess about the situation in Lombardy in particular? Any guesses as to when restrictions might ease up, and to what extent do you think things will, quote unquote, go back to normal?
Now, um, one of the problems we do have with this is that government data are quite unreliable. Um, the number of deaths is clearly underestimated. In some areas, like near Bergamo, deaths could be, well, 2 times as many as we
Wow.
noticed, because of people that just died
Yeah.
in the flats, in the homes. Um, and therefore, the national data, which are released, that are released every night, um, are not really proving a good um, lighthouse for policymakers. Having said that, there is one thing which is getting better, and instead, as the data is quite reliable, which is the number of people in intensive care.
Mm.
Lombardy at clear, I mean, the Lombardy ruling class, the Lombardy healthcare management, clearly did some mistakes in dealing with the outbreak. Um, I think the biggest mistake they made was making the all over region a red zone instead of getting a smaller red zone near Bergamo, and that was actually a failure of a weak political class. Now reports that came out, and basically they couldn't decide because nobody wanted to be responsible for that decision, and things escalated. So that was clearly one big mistake. The other big mistake was putting patients in senior residences, and that
Mm.
was clearly a very bad mistake. A bigger problem, which is nationwide, is clearly family contagion. So you lock people in their houses,
Yeah.
but you lock older people with younger people, and some infections, some problems came out of that. And one tragedy, a very important thing that we need to stop is the fact that, as I suppose in any pandemic, I mean, Thucydides is writing that about the Athenian plague. The first one to die are doctors and nurses,
Yep.
who are really in the front line. Having said all of that, Lombardy doubled intensive care units in basically 1 month. Um, so they did it. At the beginning of this emergency, if I remember correctly, it was uh, 817 ECUs in the whole of the region. Now is 1,400 something. Um, Last week, something like 1,300 patients were in intensive care. Uh, Yesterday, it was 900. So the situation improved from that viewpoint, and I think this is an indicator which is quite reliable. The problem, in as far as the reopening is concerned, a big problem has been a very confused communication.
Mm.
To give you a sense, on not this week, but the week before, on Saturday, there was a fight really between the local government and the national government, because the local government thought that actually Rome was taking measures that were too light and possibly jeopardizing the effectiveness of the lockdown. So that was on the Saturday, and then on right after Easter, um, I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, out of the blue, the president of Lombardy announced Lombardy is going to be reopened on is going to reopening on May the 4th. So in less than 1 week, the regional government moved from criticize a position in which it was effectively criticizing the government for his light touch to uh, basically claiming we have a date, we shall have a plan, but we have a date, and we're going to be aiming in, to go back to some kind of normal on May 1st. I think it's so confused a situation that it's very difficult to have any clear vision on what's going to be happening. Um, the good thing I think in Lombardy is that now ICUs are there, and if we want to be realistic, it's not going to be like COVID is going away overnight. It's going to be a long process, and the most important thing is that the healthcare system is now equipped. So, how to calibrate the to say amount of normality that we can afford with the pressure on the healthcare system is difficult to say. I want to add something. Italians have a reputation of being quite anarchistic. I don't know if it is because we are scared, could be, but Italians have been tremendously compliant. If we look at data coming out of Apple's, for example, about people moving around, uh, clearly people did stay home. Uh, and so this is going to be changing the way in which they do behave. And I think it is very difficult to account for that in the future of the contagion, the illness, and also the way in which the economy is going to be operating. But people's behavior changed, and I won't be ruling out the possibility that this would be a very important factor um, from any point of view in the next few months. Perhaps more important than what people believe, and particularly than what our governors, our rulers believe.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alberto, and I couldn't agree more. I think one of the most interesting things to watch will be how cultural norms have changed. We've certainly had time, as you say, to change behavior, whether it's how compliant people have been or not compliant. Um, nonetheless, behavior has changed in a lot of different ways. We've had time to adjust, and it'll be interesting to see what things sort of stick and what things do not. Um, I want to thank you for taking this time.
Thank you.
It's so great to see you and see you well. I have to say too that at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, you were one of the first among my friends, while we here in the States weren't thinking much of it, to say, "Hey, pay attention." And so you you have caught my attention from the very beginning, and I've really appreciated reading your responses to the pandemic and now having a chance to have a conversation with you about it. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
And we will look forward to seeing you more on Econlog in the days to come, and maybe we can do this again sometime soon.